He was simply walking along a mountain trail when he accidentally noticed a narrow cave entrance. But inside, there was a container that physically could not have gotten there. When he opened it, he was shocked by what he saw. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The city had taught him early that space was never neutral. Every sidewalk belonged to someone. Every building carried rules invisible but enforced. Every pause invited interpretation. He had grown up learning how to move without drawing attention, how to exist without provoking questions, how to read rooms before entering them. Noise, even when unspoken, pressed constantly against his senses. Schedules, glances, expectations, the subtle demand to explain oneself at all times. For years, life had felt like a corridor with narrowing walls where every step forward required negotiation. The mountains offered something radically different. They did not care who arrived or why. They did not ask for names, documents, or intentions. They did not reward confidence or punish hesitation. They simply existed, vast and indifferent, shaped by forces that ignored human narratives entirely. When he first stepped onto a mountain trail years ago, breathing hard under the weight of his pack, he had felt an unfamiliar sensation settle into his body. It was not joy in the conventional sense, nor relief, but a loosening, as if something that had been clenched for decades had finally released. Hiking became less a hobby than a private ritual. He chose routes that demanded attention but not spectacle, paths that wound through quiet ridges and high valleys where the air thinned and thought simplified. His movements in the mountains were deliberate and economical. He never rushed. He never dramatized risk. Each step was an agreement with gravity and terrain, nothing more. He learned to read weather patterns by smell and light, to hear changes in wind before they announced themselves visually. He learned the difference between silence and absence, between danger and discomfort. This particular trip had been planned with the same care as all the others. Late season, fewer hikers, trails that still held snow in shadowed sections but remained passable. He wanted solitude without isolation, challenge without recklessness. The region lay far from the postcard versions of the Alps, away from cable cars and polished viewpoints. The mountains here were older in feeling, their slopes rougher, their paths less curated. He had chosen a route that looped across several ridges, offering long stretches without human structures or maintained shelters. As he began the ascent on the first day, the familiar rhythm returned quickly. Breath matched pace. Muscles warmed into function. The world narrowed to stone, sky, and the steady crunch of boots on gravel. He carried no music, no distractions. His phone remained powered down except for emergencies. What he sought was not escape but calibration, a return to scale. In the mountains, his problems reduced themselves to manageable dimensions. Food, water, shelter, movement. Everything else faded into background noise. He was not unaware of how he appeared to others. In trail towns and transit stations, he noticed the brief second glances, the unconscious recalculations people made when they saw him alone, geared for wilderness, comfortable in places they expected him not to be. Over time, he had learned not to internalize these moments, but they lingered nonetheless like static. In the mountains, those glances disappeared entirely. There was no audience, no assumption, no script. The land offered neither suspicion nor approval. The first hours of the hike passed smoothly. The trail climbed steadily through sparse forest before breaking into open terrain where rock replaced soil and vegetation thinned to stubborn patches clinging to cracks. The sky remained clear but pale, the kind of light that suggested change without urgency. He adjusted his layers instinctively, responding to shifts in temperature with the ease of long familiarity. His mind wandered, not toward memories or worries, but toward observation. The angle of shadows. The distant sound of wind crossing a higher saddle. The faint, almost imperceptible pressure change before a breeze. By midday, he reached a section where the official trail bent sharply east, following a long, gradual contour around a massive rock face. He paused there, studying the map, the terrain, the slope rising above him. The alternative path was not marked, but it was visible enough, a faint line etched by erosion and occasional foot traffic. Cutting upward would shorten the day's distance significantly. It was steeper, yes, and required careful footing, but nothing beyond his experience. He did not decide immediately. He rested, drank water, watched the clouds drift slowly across the upper peaks. The weather held steady, but there was a subtle thickness to the air that suggested instability later. He weighed time against effort, certainty against efficiency. This was not a reckless choice born of impatience. It was calculation, informed by years of moving through similar terrain. When he finally stepped off the official trail, the shift was subtle but immediate. The ground felt less predictable underfoot. The slope demanded attention rather than allowing rhythm. He shortened his stride, testing each placement before committing weight. Above him, the rock face rose in uneven plains, fractured and weathered, but not hostile. It felt old, settled, as though it had been this way long before paths or maps existed. As he climbed, the sounds of the wider valley fell away. Wind moved differently here, sliding along stone rather than rushing freely. The air seemed to absorb noise rather than carry it. He noticed the absence of wildlife first, a detail that registered without alarm, but lingered nonetheless. No birds traced the thermals overhead. No distant movement disturbed the slopes. The mountain felt empty in a way that was difficult to articulate, not barren, but withdrawn. It was then that he noticed the line. At first, he dismissed it as another fracture in the rock, a trick of shadow or perspective. But as he gained elevation, the line resolved into something more deliberate. It was too straight, too consistent. It cut across the stone at a shallow angle, uninterrupted by the natural chaos that defined the surrounding surface. He stopped, adjusting his position to view it from different angles. The line remained. Curiosity stirred, tempered by caution. He approached slowly, scanning the area for instability. Up close, the rock around the line showed subtle differences in texture. The weathering did not match. The stone here seemed younger somehow, or at least disturbed. He ran his gloved hand across the surface, feeling a faint change in temperature, a difference so slight it might have been imagined. As he shifted to one side, the line broke, revealing a narrow darkness where stone should have been solid. A crevice, barely visible unless one stood directly before it. He leaned closer, heart rate steady but alert. The opening was narrow, irregular, easily overlooked by anyone passing at a distance. It did not resemble a cave entrance in the traditional sense. There was no yawning mouth, no inviting depth, just a tight vertical gap, shadowed and silent. He crouched, studying it carefully. Cold air breathed faintly from within, carrying no scent of water or decay. The rock around the opening bore no claw marks, no signs of animal use. This was not a den. It was not shelter. The mountain had not shaped this casually. He straightened, glancing back down the slope he had climbed. From below, the crevice vanished entirely, swallowed by angle and shadow. Whatever lay inside was hidden not by effort, but by geometry. He stood there longer than he intended, weighing the pull of curiosity against the discipline that had kept him safe through countless trips. The decision to look inside felt less like a choice and more like the continuation of a path already taken. He set his pack down carefully, securing it against the slope, and tested the opening with a boot. The stone held. He turned sideways, easing himself toward the narrow darkness, unaware that this moment marked the end of a life measured by distance and elevation, and the beginning of something far less chartable. The mountain remained silent as he disappeared into the rock. The darkness closed around him almost immediately. The light from outside thinned to a narrow blade that slid along the stone as he eased himself farther into the crevice. His shoulders brushed rock on both sides, the cold seeping through fabric and into muscle. He controlled his breathing carefully, keeping it slow and even, resisting the instinct to rush. Panic had no utility here. The mountain did not respond to urgency. The passage forced him to move sideways, one foot probing for purchase before the other followed. The stone pressed against his back, uneven and unforgiving, yet stable. He tested each surface with deliberate pressure, feeling for vibration, for weakness, for the telltale grain that suggested instability. Nothing shifted. The rock felt ancient, settled into itself, as though it had accepted its own shape long ago. For several moments, the world narrowed to friction and balance. Sound dulled, absorbed by stone. Even the wind he had felt moments earlier vanished, replaced by a stillness that seemed almost artificial. He became acutely aware of the weight of his body, of how much space it occupied, of how little margin for error existed between movement and entrapment. He reminded himself that he could still retreat. The opening, while narrow, was not yet impossible. Then, without warning, the pressure eased. The rock on his left fell away first, opening into space. He paused, adjusting his stance, then shifted his weight forward. The passage widened abruptly, releasing him into a larger cavity where he could stand upright. He exhaled slowly, the sound oddly loud in the enclosed space. The air here was cooler but dry, carrying none of the mineral dampness he associated with natural caves. The floor beneath his boots felt level, too level, composed not of loose scree or irregular stone, but of a surface worn smooth by time or design. He turned back toward the entrance. From inside, it looked even narrower, the outside light reduced to a distorted sliver framed by jagged stone. The realization settled uneasily that once he stepped deeper, that sliver might vanish entirely, swallowed by angle and shadow. He noted the exact position of the opening, committing it to memory, tracing its outline with his eyes, until he felt confident he could find it again in darkness if necessary. The chamber extended farther than he could see. He switched on his headlamp, the beam cutting a clean arc through the gloom. The light revealed stone walls rising at measured angles, their surfaces marked by long, shallow striations that ran parallel for several meters before fading. They did not resemble the chaotic textures left by water erosion or tectonic fracture. They looked deliberate, as though something had passed repeatedly along them with weight and purpose. He moved forward slowly, the sound of his boots muted, almost swallowed by the space. The temperature remained constant, unaffected by his movement. There was no drip in water, no echo of distant chambers, none of the organic sounds that usually accompanied underground spaces. The silence was total, heavy in a way that pressed against his ears. His thoughts returned briefly to the decision that had led him here. Leaving the marked trail had been a rational calculation, not a gamble. Discovering the crevice had been chance, yes, but chance layered atop observation. He reminded himself of this, anchoring his actions in reason rather than impulse. Yet, the deeper he went, the more that reasoning felt like something applied after the fact, an explanation rather than a cause. The chamber widened further, opening into a broad space whose ceiling disappeared beyond the reach of his lamp. He swept the beam upward, but it dissolved into darkness before finding any definitive boundary. The walls curved gently inward, not closing but enclosing, shaping the space with an almost architectural sensibility. This was not a natural void left by accident. Even without training in geology or engineering, he could feel the difference in his bones. He knelt and touched the floor, running his gloved hand across the surface. Fine dust coated his fingers, but beneath it the stone was compact, almost polished. There were no footprints, no recent disturbances, but the dust itself lay unevenly, thinner in some areas, thicker in others, as though something large had once occupied the space and altered how particles settled over time. As he advanced, the beam of his headlamp caught on something metallic far ahead. The light reflected sharply, a hard glint that stood in stark contrast to the matte stone around it. He stopped immediately, heart rate ticking upward, every sense tightening. Metal did not belong here. Not in this volume, not with this silence. He adjusted the angle of the beam, narrowing its focus. The reflection resolved into a flat plane, vertical and massive. He could not yet make out its full shape, only its scale. It blocked the far end of the chamber entirely, rising from the floor to a height his light could not fully trace. The closer he moved, the more the object asserted itself as something fundamentally out of place. With each step, the space seemed to reorganize around it. The walls straightened subtly, the floor leveled further, as though the chamber had been shaped to accommodate the presence now revealed. His mind began assembling possibilities, rejecting them almost as quickly as they formed. Aircraft debris did not look like this. Geological anomalies did not reflect light at such clean angles. When he finally stood before it, the reality struck with a force that momentarily displaced breath from his lungs. A full-sized cargo container occupied the heart of the chamber. It rested flush against the stone, and its base aligned so precisely with the floor that it appeared anchored rather than placed. Rust bloomed across its surface in irregular patches, the familiar reddish-brown corrosion softened by time and dry air. Faded markings clung to the metal, half erased by years of oxidation, their original meaning obscured but unmistakably industrial. This was not a fragment, not debris. It was intact, whole, and unmistakable. He circled it slowly, his light tracing the edges, the seams, the reinforced corners. The container's proportions were exact, standardized to a global system that allowed such objects to move effortlessly from ship to rail to truck. The absurdity of its presence pressed against his rational mind. There was no path by which it could have entered this chamber through the narrow crevice he had just navigated. None that did not violate basic physics. He measured the opening with his eyes, replaying the passage in memory. Even disassembled, the container's panels would not have fit without leaving scars, without evidence of cutting or assembly, yet the container showed no seams beyond its original construction. The walls of the chamber bore no marks of recent excavation, no blast fractures, no tool scars consistent with large-scale modification. He reached out and placed his palm against the metal. It was cold, colder than the surrounding stone, holding temperature in a way that suggested mass and density. The surface vibrated faintly beneath his touch, not with motion, but with a subtle resonance, as though the container existed slightly out of sync with the space around it. A wave of unease rolled through him, slow and heavy. This was not the thrill of discovery. It was the discomfort of encountering something that should not exist here, something that undermined the assumptions he used to navigate the world. The mountains, which had always offered clarity and scale, now presented him with an object that belonged entirely to another system, another logic. He stepped back, widening his stance, forcing himself to breathe evenly. He scanned the chamber again, searching for explanation in detail. The walls near the container were smoother than those near the entrance, their contours more controlled. The dust pattern around its base suggested long-term presence rather than recent placement. Everything pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. The container had not been brought into the cave. The cave had been formed around the container. The realization settled slowly, rearranging his understanding of the space he occupied. This was not shelter, not a hiding place improvised in haste. It was infrastructure, purpose-built, concealed not just by location but by design. The narrow entrance was not a barrier accidentally preserved by time. It was a filter. He stood there for a long moment, the beam of his headlamp resting on the rusted metal, aware that the decision he had made hours earlier to leave the marked trail had carried him beyond the boundaries of casual exploration. The broken route had not merely altered his path through the mountains, it had delivered him into the presence of something that existed outside the narratives he understood. Behind him, the entrance remained silent and unchanged, a thin seam of darkness leading back to open air. Ahead of him loomed the container, sealed, patient, waiting. The mountains had not revealed this place easily, and whatever lay beyond this moment would not allow itself to be forgotten. Standing before the container, he became acutely aware of the distance he had already crossed, not measured in meters, but in commitment. The chamber no longer felt like an extension of the mountain, but like a threshold space, a place designed to hold attention and slow decision. He turned away from the rusted metal and forced himself to retrace his steps, not toward escape, but toward understanding. If this place had been shaped intentionally, then every detail mattered, including the path by which he had entered. He moved back toward the narrow passage, this time with heightened awareness. The floor beneath his boots remained level, its subtle smoothness now unmistakable. Each step produced a muted sound that died quickly, absorbed by the geometry of the chamber. The walls did not echo. They seemed to consume vibration, as though the space had been engineered not only to conceal, but to silence. When he reached the entrance, he stopped just short of the constriction. From this side, the opening appeared even more implausible as an access point. It was a vertical slit, irregular but decisively narrow, its edges worn not by repeated passage, but by time. The rock bore the faint rounding that came from long exposure to air and temperature change, not from friction. Whatever process had shaped this opening, it had not been used frequently, if at all. He knelt and studied the stone closely, running his fingers along the inner edges. The texture shifted subtly at certain points, transitioning from rough to almost polished, as if sections had once been reinforced or treated. The stone here felt denser, colder, its surface holding the chill longer than the surrounding rock. There were no tool marks, no obvious seams, but the uniformity of the constriction suggested intent rather than coincidence. He angled his headlamp outward, letting the beam spill through the slit and into the open air beyond. From inside, the outside world appeared distorted, reduced to a compressed slice of light and color. The slope he had climbed earlier was invisible from this angle. The sky beyond the opening had shifted since his entry, its tone darker now, clouds thickening into layered bands that hinted at incoming weather. The realization that conditions were changing outside added a subtle urgency, though he resisted letting it dictate his actions. He tested the opening again with his body, leaning forward until Stone pressed against his shoulders and hips. Even without his pack, the fit was tight. Any object larger than a person would have been impossible to move through without altering the rock itself. There were no signs that such alteration had ever occurred. The entrance was not the remains of a larger opening collapsed over time. It had always been this way. Rising slowly, he turned back toward the chamber, his gaze inevitably drawn once more to the container. The impossibility of its presence no longer felt abstract. It was physical, undeniable. The mind searched for explanations not because they were likely, but because the alternative was to accept that the rules governing space and movement had been selectively suspended here. He began to walk the perimeter of the chamber, tracing the boundary where stone met floor. The curvature of the walls was consistent, their inward slope calculated to distribute weight evenly. This was not the chaotic architecture of a natural cavern. It resembled a cavity formed by removal rather than collapse, as though material had been extracted methodically, leaving behind surfaces optimized for stability. The absence of debris reinforced the impression. No rubble lay piled in corners. No fragments hinted at excavation. Whatever stone had once filled this space was no longer here and had not been left nearby. As he circled, he noticed subtle variations in the dust pattern along the floor. In some areas, the layer was thin, disturbed long ago, and never fully resettled. In others, it lay thicker, untouched. The pattern radiated outward from the container itself, suggesting that the object had been present before the dust had settled, acting as an obstacle around which particles accumulated over time. The container had not arrived after the chamber was formed. It had been integral to its existence. He stopped near the rear wall, directly opposite the entrance, and swept his light across the stone. Here, the surface bore faint discolorations, darker bands that followed the curvature of the chamber. They looked like shadows that had been burned into the rock, traces of heat or pressure applied gradually rather than violently. The mountain here did not feel broken. It felt altered. The thought unsettled him more than any notion of explosives or machinery. Destruction left scars. This place bore signs of precision. He returned to the container, drawn now not by curiosity but by the need to anchor himself to something tangible. He examined its exterior again, this time with a different eye. The rust patterns told the story of long exposure to dry air, slow oxidation rather than rapid decay. The container had not been sealed in a damp environment. It had breathed, in its own way, over years or decades. He crouched near one corner, inspecting the reinforced steel fittings. These were standard, mass-produced components, designed for cranes and ships, not for caves. Their presence emphasized the dissonance between object and environment. This was infrastructure from a global supply chain, a piece of the world's logistical bloodstream, now embedded deep within a mountain that predated that system by millions of years. His thoughts drifted briefly to scale. How many resources had been required to create this place? How much planning? How much time? The chamber had not been carved hastily. It had been shaped, refined, tested. The narrow entrance functioned as a final concealment, a way to render the space invisible to anyone not already aware of its existence. This was not about security through strength. It was security through improbability. A faint sensation crept over him then, difficult to define. It was not fear in the immediate sense, nor excitement. It was the awareness of standing within something unfinished, or rather something ongoing. This place did not feel abandoned. It felt paused. He checked his watch, surprised by how much time had passed since he had entered the crevice. The mountain outside continued its rhythms without him, clouds building, wind shifting. Inside, time seemed to move differently, marked not by light or sound but by the slow accumulation of understanding. He considered leaving. The rational part of him urged retreat, a return to the known, the mapped, the explainable. He could step back through the narrow opening, collect his pack, rejoin the trail, and carry this discovery as an unanswered question. Yet the idea felt incomplete, almost dishonest. He had already crossed the threshold. To leave now without deeper examination would not restore balance. It would only defer it. He stood and approached the container's doors. They faced the rear wall of the chamber, positioned so that opening them would direct their contents inward rather than toward the entrance. The locking bars were intact, their surfaces pitted with corrosion but structurally sound. The handles resisted his initial test, stiff with age and disuse. He did not force them yet. Instead, he examined the seals. The edges where metal met metal. The seals were intact, no warping, no signs of prying, no gaps widened by repeated access. Whatever lay inside had been sealed deliberately and left that way. This realization brought a new dimension to the puzzle. If the container had been accessed periodically, as the dust pattern suggested, then it had not been opened here. It must have been designed to allow interaction without breaking its primary seal. He stepped back again, scanning the chamber for auxiliary structures, panels, or conduits. There were none visible. The space was austere, stripped of anything that might draw attention or provide clues. Its emptiness was itself a form of camouflage. The air felt heavier now, though he knew that was perception rather than pressure. His awareness had sharpened to a fine edge. Every sound he made seemed amplified within his own head, each movement echoing internally rather than outwardly. The mountains had always offered him clarity through simplicity. Here, simplicity masked complexity. He returned once more to the entrance, standing before the narrow slit and looking out. The sky beyond had darkened further, clouds pressing low against the ridges. The weather was turning, slowly but decisively. He calculated the time it would take to exit, to retrieve his pack, to descend back toward safer ground before conditions deteriorated. The calculation mattered less than it should have. He turned back toward the container, his decision forming not as a sudden resolve but as a quiet acceptance. Whatever this place was, it existed independently of his presence. But now that he had found it, his life would not simply resume its previous trajectory untouched. Understanding had become a necessity rather than a choice. He placed his hands on the cold steel of the locking bars, feeling the weight of the mechanism beneath his palms. The narrow entrance behind him framed nothing but darkness and distant light, a reminder of the world that still operated by familiar rules. Ahead of him stood the container, sealed, impossible, waiting. The mountains did not intervene. They never had. And so, with deliberate care, he began to work at the locks, unaware that the next moments would not only reveal the contents of the container, but permanently alter the shape of his understanding of the world beyond the stone. The locking bars resisted at first, not with the stiffness of rust alone, but with the quiet refusal of a mechanism that had not been disturbed in a very long time. He adjusted his grip, repositioned his feet on the smooth stone floor, and applied steady pressure rather than force. The metal responded reluctantly, emitting a low, muted groan that seemed to sink into the chamber rather than echo. The sound unsettled him more than it should have. It did not ring or reverberate. It vanished, as if the space itself had been built to swallow noise before it could travel. He paused, listening, though there was nothing to hear. His own breathing sounded too loud, too close. He slowed it deliberately, counting the rhythm until his pulse settled. The mountains had taught him patience long before this moment. Rushing never produced clarity. It only produced mistakes. He worked the second bar with the same care. The corrosion flaked slightly beneath his fingers, rust dust falling in a thin line to the floor. The flakes scattered unevenly, some drifting farther than others before settling. He watched them fall, noting how they behaved, how the air in the chamber moved almost imperceptibly, guided by geometry rather than draft. Even here, inside stone, airflow had been anticipated. When the final locking mechanism released, the container remained closed. The doors did not swing open on their own. They stayed where they were, heavy and inert, their mass asserting itself. He placed his hands against the cold steel and pushed slowly. The hinges answered with a deep, controlled resistance, not seized, not damaged, simply bearing weight as designed. The doors opened a few centimeters at first, revealing nothing but darkness within. A smell escaped then, faint but unmistakable. Not decay, not mold, but the sterile, dry scent of old metal and sealed air. It reminded him of warehouses he had passed through in cities, vast storage spaces where goods waited silently under fluorescent lights. The familiarity of the scent was disorienting here, in a place that otherwise denied every association with human industry. He widened the gap, bracing himself against the door's momentum. As the opening grew, the beam of his headlamp slipped inside, illuminating the container's interior in a narrow slice. The light caught on smooth surfaces, repeating shapes, edges aligned with almost mathematical precision. He froze, his body responding before his mind fully processed what he was seeing. The container was full, not cluttered, not hastily packed, but filled with an order so exact it felt ceremonial. Rows of identical suitcases extended from floor to ceiling, from the threshold to the far wall. Each suitcase was encased in a transparent vacuum seal, the plastic pulled tight around hard corners and handles, compressing the form until it looked almost sculptural. The repetition was overwhelming. Hundreds at least, perhaps thousands, arranged with uniform spacing that allowed no wasted volume. He stepped back instinctively, then forward again, adjusting the angle of the doors to allow more light inside. The beam traced the rows, revealing no labels, no external markings. The suitcases were identical in size, shape, and color, stripped of individuality. This was not luggage meant to travel. It was storage, standardized to eliminate distinction. He crossed the threshold slowly, the soles of his boots making contact with the container's metal floor. The sound changed subtly, a duller resonance than the stone outside. The air inside felt denser, cooler, preserved. His headlamp illuminated the nearest suitcase. The plastic stretched tight across its surface, seams sealed with industrial precision. There were no signs of deterioration, no clouding of plastic, no trapped moisture. Whatever process had been used to package these items had been thorough, designed to last. He knelt and examined one of the suitcases more closely. The handle was compressed beneath the vacuum seal, flattened but intact. The zipper tracks were visible but inaccessible, locked beneath layers of plastic. He ran a finger along the surface, feeling the slight give where air had been removed. The suitcase resisted pressure, its contents packed solidly. A thought surfaced then, quiet but insistent. He had not yet seen money. He had only assumed it. The realization sharpened his focus. He reached for his multi-tool, the familiar weight grounding him. With careful movements, he cut to the plastic along one edge, slicing just deep enough to break the seal. The material parted with a faint hiss as air rushed in, the sound startling in its intimacy. He froze again, listening, waiting for some response from the space beyond the container. Nothing followed. He peeled back the plastic and opened the suitcase. Inside, the light revealed stacks of currency, arranged in tight, uniform bundles. The bills were crisp, their edges sharp, their colors unfaded. They filled the suitcase completely, packed with no room for movement. He did not need to touch them to recognize their authenticity. The texture, the alignment, the density spoke of real money, not replicas. Multiple currencies were visible within the same case, organized into sections, each stack wrapped and banded. He closed the suitcase slowly, his hands steady despite the surge of sensation in his chest. He stood and stepped back, letting the scale of what he was seeing expand beyond a single object. One suitcase held enough money to alter a life irrevocably. There were hundreds of such cases within reach, and likely many more beyond. The numbers began to assemble themselves unbidden. The total weight alone suggested staggering value. This was not a cache assembled by individuals. It was not the hoard of a criminal organization hiding profits from a single operation. The uniformity, the packaging, the location, all pointed toward something far more systematic. He moved deeper into the container, navigating the narrow aisle left intentionally cleared down the center. His headlamp revealed subtle variations among the suitcases. Some bore minor scuffs beneath the plastic, marks of handling. Others were pristine. The differences were small but meaningful. They suggested movement, not random, but selective. He stopped midway down the aisle and turned, scanning the interior from this vantage point. The container's walls were clean, unmarked, their paint faded but intact. No graffiti, no notes, no signs of hurried activity. This was not a place of desperation. It was a place of control. His thoughts returned to the chamber outside, to the dust patterns, to the sense that the container had been part of the space rather than inserted into it. The interior confirmed that impression. This was not storage intended to be forgotten. It was storage designed to persist, to remain available across time without attracting attention. He knelt again, selecting another suitcase at random. This one contained a different arrangement of currencies, newer series mixed with older ones, some notes bearing designs he recognized from his own lifetime, others older, retired from circulation. The variety suggested long-term accumulation, not a single influx. Money had been added, rotated, perhaps withdrawn and replaced. The implications unsettled him more than the sheer value. Money like this did not sit idle. It represented influence, contingency, leverage. It existed to be used at moments when traditional systems failed or could not be trusted. This was not wealth waiting to be spent. It was power waiting to be deployed. He straightened slowly, his gaze lingering on the repeating forms. The container felt less like a box now and more like a vault, though without the usual symbols of security. No biometric locks, no electronic systems. Security here was achieved through isolation and improbability, through the assumption that no one would ever stand where he stood now. He considered, briefly, the idea of taking something. The thought surfaced not as temptation, but as an intellectual exercise. What would it mean to remove a single suitcase? Would its absence be noticed? The dust patterns outside suggested periodic access, but that access had likely been accounted for. An unexpected discrepancy, even small, could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. He dismissed the idea as quickly as it arose. Taking money would not simplify anything. It would entangle him in a system he did not understand and could not control. The mountains had taught him respect for forces larger than himself. This was one such force, albeit wearing the shape of human creation. He closed the suitcase he had opened and carefully resealed the plastic as best he could, though he knew the seal would never be perfect again. He marked its position mentally, noting its place among the others. This was not evidence to be catalogued. It was a detail to be remembered. As he backed toward the container's doors, he felt a subtle shift in his perception of the chamber beyond. It no longer seemed empty. It seemed occupied, not physically, but conceptually. The presence of the container radiated outward, shaping the space around it, giving context to every stone surface and shadow. At the threshold, he paused and looked back one last time. The rows of suitcases receded into the darkness beyond his lamp's reach, their identical forms dissolving into abstraction. The container had revealed its contents, but not its purpose. That understanding would come later, if at all. He pulled the doors closed with the same care he had used to open them, ensuring the locking bars returned to their original positions. The sound of metal meeting metal was final, deliberate. The container was sealed once more, its secret intact despite his intrusion. Stepping back into the chamber, he felt the weight of what he had seen settle fully into him. The discovery was no longer theoretical. It had mass, volume, consequence. The broken route that had led him here had delivered him into the presence of something that existed beyond the margins of ordinary life. Behind him, the container stood silent and closed. Ahead of him, the narrow entrance framed the distant world, unchanged in appearance but no longer neutral. He knew with a certainty that surprised him that this place was not finished with him yet. For a long time after resealing the container, he remained standing in the chamber, motionless, as though his body needed time to catch up with what his mind had already accepted. The act of closing the doors had not restored the space to its previous neutrality. If anything, it had sharpened his awareness of the container's presence. It stood there now not as an object of curiosity, but as a fact, heavy and immutable, exerting a quiet authority over the chamber that housed it. He moved away from it slowly, taking measured steps back toward the center of the chamber. The narrow entrance remained visible in the distance, a thin vertical seam of dim light that seemed almost unreal after the ordered density of the container's interior. The contrast unsettled him. Outside lay unpredictability, weather, chance encounters, paths that shifted with erosion and season. Inside lay a system so carefully controlled that even time appeared to move differently around it. He sat down on the stone floor, his back against the curved wall, and allowed himself to breathe without calculation. His muscles trembled faintly, not from exertion, but from the delayed release of tension. Only now did he feel how much effort it had taken to keep his reactions measured, his movements deliberate. The mountains had taught him endurance, but this was a different kind of strain. It was the weight of comprehension. His thoughts began to organize themselves, no longer scattered impressions but sequences of cause and implication, He replayed the process of opening the container in his mind, not as memory but as analysis. The resistance of the locks, the condition of the seals, the air inside, everything pointed toward long-term intent. This was not a cache abandoned in haste. It was maintained, if not physically, then conceptually. Its existence had been planned across years, perhaps decades. The question that now pressed against him was not why such a place existed, but how it was meant to function. He stood again and approached the container once more, this time not as a discoverer, but as an observer trying to understand design. He traced the outline of the doors with his light, examining the hinges, the locking bars, the points where stress would concentrate. There were no signs of reinforcement beyond standard construction, no hidden electronics, no visible mechanisms that would suggest advanced security. The container relied on its location for protection, on the assumption that no one would ever stand here without already knowing it existed. That assumption had been broken. He crouched near the base of the container and examined the floor. The seam where metal met stone was nearly invisible, the fit so precise it suggested deliberate leveling. The stone beneath bore faint discoloration, darker than the surrounding floor as though compressed over long periods by the container's weight. This object had not been shifted. It had settled, becoming part of the chamber's physical memory. He followed the seam along the length of the container, noting how the floor remained consistent, uninterrupted by cracks or natural irregularities. The stone here had been worked, shaped subtly but thoroughly, not polished, not decorative, but functional. This was infrastructure, stripped of all unnecessary expression. His attention returned to the suitcases inside. The uniformity was too exact to be accidental. Standardization reduced error, simplified accounting, allowed for predictable handling. Whoever had designed this system had prioritized efficiency over symbolism. The money was not meant to inspire awe or loyalty. It was meant to be available. He recalled the minor variations he had noticed among the cases, the scuffs, the differences in currency series. Those details suggested use over time, but use governed by rules. Not random withdrawals, not theft. Access had been controlled, measured. The container functioned not as a hoard but as a reserve, something to be drawn upon under specific conditions. The realization carried a subtle shift in his perception of risk. If the money had been static, forgotten, then discovery might have remained theoretical, a curiosity to be reported or concealed, but a reserve implied watchers. Not guards in the conventional sense, but systems of awareness, processes that tracked balance and availability across locations unknown to him. He straightened and scanned the chamber again, this time with the eyes of someone searching for oversight rather than storage. There were no cameras, no obvious sensors, yet the absence itself felt intentional. Any electronic presence would have required maintenance, power, replacement. This place avoided dependency. Its security lay in isolation and permanence. A thought emerged then, unsettling in its simplicity. Perhaps the container did not need to be monitored continuously. Perhaps it was meant to exist unnoticed until needed, its location known only to a small number of individuals at any given time, passed along through channels that left no permanent record. Knowledge, rather than hardware, served as the key. The idea made him acutely aware of his own role. He had acquired knowledge he was never meant to have. The system had not accounted for someone like him, someone who did not fit into its expected patterns of movement or interest. A hiker, alone, off-trail, motivated by terrain rather than profit. He considered what would happen next if he did nothing. If he left quietly, returned to the trail, resumed his route, and carried this discovery as a private anomaly. The container would remain. The reserve would remain intact. The system would continue functioning as designed, unaware of the breach. But the breach had already occurred, regardless of action. The mere fact of his awareness altered the equation, even if no one else ever learned of it. He understood that now with a clarity that surprised him. Some knowledge, once acquired, could not be neutralized by silence. He checked his watch again. More time had passed than he realized. Outside, the weather would be deteriorating. The practical part of his mind asserted itself, reminding him that mountains did not wait for intellectual resolution. He needed to move, to decide. Before leaving, he made one final circuit of the chamber, slower than before, imprinting details into memory. The curvature of the walls, the subtle changes in stone color, the position of the container relative to the entrance. He did not take photographs. He did not mark the space. He understood instinctively that leaving physical traces would be both futile and dangerous. Memory would have to suffice. When he reached the narrow entrance, he paused, looking back once more at the container. In the dim light, it appeared almost abstract, its edges softened by shadow. The suitcases inside were invisible now, sealed away behind metal and darkness. Yet their presence felt undeniable, like a pressure system beneath the surface of the world. He turned and began the careful process of exiting the crevice. The stone pressed against him again, reclaiming his body inch by inch. The movement demanded focus, drawing him back into the physical immediacy of friction and balance. For a brief moment, the complexity of what he had seen receded, replaced by the simple imperative to move without error. When he emerged into open air, the change was abrupt. Wind struck his face, carrying the scent of snow and stone. The sky had darkened significantly, clouds stacked thick and low against the peaks. Light diffused through them unevenly, flattening contrast and muting color. The mountain felt heavier now, more assertive. He retrieved his pack quickly, securing it without lingering. As he began to descend, his movements regained their earlier rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. The mountains no longer felt like a space apart from the systems of the world below. They had been integrated into them, quietly, deliberately. As he navigated the slope, his thoughts returned to the container not as an object but as a node, one point in a network whose full extent he could not see. The money inside represented not just value, but a preparedness, a contingency against disruption, a way to exert influence when conventional channels failed. The implication unsettled him deeply. He had always believed that systems revealed themselves through scale and visibility, through institutions and infrastructure that announced their presence. This place suggested the opposite, that the most powerful mechanisms might operate best when unseen, embedded within landscapes assumed to be neutral or empty. By the time he rejoined the marked trail, snow had begun to fall lightly, the first flakes drifting down without urgency. He adjusted his pace, aware that conditions could worsen quickly. The practical demands of the hike reasserted themselves, pulling his attention outward. Yet beneath that focus ran a current he could not still. The opening of the container had not satisfied his curiosity. It had transformed it. What he now carried was not the image of money stacked in suitcases, but the understanding that such reserves existed at all, hidden within the bones of the world. As he moved downhill, leaving the chamber concealed behind stone and distance, He did not feel relief. He felt the weight of connection, the sense that by opening the container, he had brushed against a system that did not forget contact. The mountain remained indifferent, snow settling quietly on rock and path alike. But he no longer believed indifference meant innocence. And though the container was sealed once more, he knew that something else had been opened, something far more difficult to close. The descent forced his body back into familiar patterns, but his mind lagged behind, still circling the chamber he had left sealed inside the mountain. Snow thickened as he lost elevation, the flakes growing heavier, more deliberate, until they erased detail and reduced the world to movement and balance. He adjusted instinctively, shortening his stride, testing each step, letting the terrain dictate pace. Yet, beneath that practiced attention ran a second layer of awareness that refused to quiet. He reached a lower saddle before dusk and made the decision to stop early. The weather no longer offered choices. Wind pressed down from above, driving snow sideways, flattening it against stone. He pitched his shelter in the lee of a rock outcrop, hands moving efficiently, the routine grounding him. When he finally sat inside, insulated from the worst of the elements, the silence returned, deeper now for having been earned. It was in that enforced stillness that the details he had observed inside the container began to reorder themselves. At first, his thoughts returned to the suitcases in simple repetition, the sheer number of them, the disciplined order. But gradually, more specific images asserted themselves. The faint scuffs beneath the plastic, the uneven settling of dust in the chamber, the subtle differences between stacks that should, by all logic, have been identical. These were not the marks of initial placement. They were traces of interaction. He closed his eyes and reconstructed the interior as precisely as he could. The central aisle, intentionally left clear. The way certain suitcases showed compression marks that did not align perfectly with their neighbors, as if they had been removed and replaced, the presence of newer banknotes beside older series that should not have coexisted unless someone had curated them deliberately. This was not storage meant to preserve a moment in time. It was storage meant to bridge time. The realization deepened his unease. A static hoard could be explained by greed, by fear, by collapse. An active reserve implied foresight. It implied an understanding of cycles, of moments when conventional systems faltered and alternative means were required. Whoever had created the container did not expect stability to last forever. They had planned for disruption. The wind rattled his shelter, snapping his attention briefly back to the present. He checked the seams, tightened one corner, then settled again, letting the storm do what it would. There was no urgency now. The mountain had closed around him for the night. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and interrupted. Each time he drifted off, images of the chamber returned, not as fear, but as insistence. The mountain reshaped itself around the container again and again, stone flowing like water, closing, sealing, concealing. When he finally woke fully, dawn had not yet broken. The snow outside had softened into a steady hush, the storm exhausting itself. He emerged from the shelter into a world newly simplified. Fresh snow smoothed the terrain, erasing tracks and edges alike. The sky remained heavy but calm, light diffused evenly across cloud and slope. The mountain looked untouched, pristine, offering no hint of what lay sealed within its core. As he resumed his descent, the clarity of daylight sharpened his thinking. Distance from the chamber did not lessen its impact. Instead, it allowed him to examine it without the immediate pressure of presence. He began to understand that the most important question was not how the container had been placed, but how it had been accessed. The narrow entrance alone made frequent physical access improbable. The effort required to pass through it, unburdened, was non-trivial. Transporting even a single suitcase through that constriction would have been difficult and conspicuous. The absence of damage to the opening suggested that such movement had been rare, if it had occurred at all. This led him back to the interior details. If the suitcases had been moved, perhaps the container itself had not been opened in the way he had opened it. Perhaps the system relied on rotation rather than extraction. Money removed elsewhere, replaced here. Or perhaps the scuffs indicated something subtler: reorganization, inspection, confirmation rather than use. The idea unsettled him. That meant the container might serve as a benchmark rather than a source, a fixed reference point against which balances were measured, assurances confirmed. The money inside did not need to be spent to be powerful. Its existence alone could underwrite actions taken elsewhere. By the time he reached the valley floor, the trail had transformed from isolation to quiet familiarity. He passed abandoned huts, weathered signs, the occasional set of footprints softened by snow. Civilization, even in its thinnest alpine form, began to reassert itself. With it came the subtle pressure of choice. He stopped near a frozen stream and drank deeply, letting the cold water steady him. This was the point at which his usual trips resolved themselves. From here, he would plan his exit, calculate transport, anticipate the return to ordinary life. Now, that return felt provisional, as though something essential had shifted beyond recall. He considered reporting the find immediately. Mountain authorities, geological surveys, even local law enforcement. The impulse arose not from fear, but from habit, the ingrained assumption that anomalies belonged to institutions. Yet, each time he imagined the act, the sequence that followed grew stranger rather than clearer. Forms filled, reports filed, coordinates logged. And then what? The container did not fit any category those systems were designed to process. It was not a hazard in the conventional sense. It was not a crime scene, at least not visibly. It was not lost property. Any report would force it into frameworks that misunderstood it fundamentally. More troubling was the speed with which such a report would travel. Information did not move slowly in the modern world. It propagated, duplicated, attracted attention from entities far beyond the original recipient. The container's security had relied on obscurity, not force. To expose it prematurely would be to destroy the very condition that made it intelligible. He realized then that the system he had glimpsed inside the mountain likely accounted for this as well. That its creators understood not only logistics and concealment, but human behavior. They knew that discovery did not automatically lead to disclosure. That individuals, faced with something too large to contextualize, often hesitated. The thought did not absolve him of responsibility. It sharpened it. By the time he reached the small transit village at the edge of the region, night had fallen again. Lights glowed behind frosted windows. A single road wound down toward lower elevations, carrying the promise of connection. He booked a room without difficulty, his presence unremarkable among the few late-season travelers. Inside, warmth closed around him, unfamiliar after days of cold. He sat on the edge of the bed and removed his boots, the mundane act anchoring him. Outside, the mountain loomed invisible, its secrets buried beneath snow and stone. As he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts returned one last time to the container's interior. Not to the money itself, but to the discipline of its arrangement. Someone had believed deeply in preparation, in redundancy, in the necessity of resources untouched by visibility or law. And someone, somewhere, might eventually notice that something had changed. Not a missing suitcase, perhaps, but a disturbance, a presence. The faintest deviation from expectation. He understood then that discovery did not require removal. Awareness alone altered the equation. The container had been used before. That much was clear. And now, unknowingly, it had been used again, not as a source of money, but as a point of contact. He slept poorly, and when morning came, he carried with him the certainty that what he had found was not finished. Not with the mountain, not with the world beyond it, and not with him. He did not return to the mountain immediately. The decision was not born of fear, but of instinct sharpened by experience. Some things, once seen, demanded distance before they could be approached again with clarity. He left the village the next morning under low cloud, descending into valleys where snow turned to slush and stone gave way to asphalt. The transition felt abrupt, like waking from a dream whose logic refused to dissolve with daylight. The world below the peaks moved at a different pace. Trains arrived on schedule. Cafes opened and closed by the clock. People navigated their days with the quiet assurance that space obeyed rules and that anomalies belonged elsewhere, in news reports or fiction. He passed through this order unnoticed, carrying nothing that marked him as altered except a persistent weight behind his eyes. For several days, he said nothing. He replayed the route in his mind repeatedly, refining the memory until it felt fixed, reliable. He reconstructed the slope, the line in the rock, the angle of light at the entrance, the way the chamber expanded just beyond the narrow constriction. He rehearsed it not as nostalgia, but as verification. If he chose to speak, he wanted certainty to precede consequence. When he finally decided to act, he did so deliberately. He contacted a regional authority responsible for geological safety, presenting his report not as a mystery but as a potential hazard. He described an anomalous underground cavity, unusual structural features, the presence of a large metallic object embedded within stone. He avoided speculation. He provided coordinates with precision, contextualized by terrain markers rather than direct reference points. The language he used was careful, technical, restrained. The response came faster than he expected. Within hours, his message was acknowledged. Within a day, follow-up questions arrived, requesting clarification on access routes, on stability, on whether the site posed immediate danger to hikers or wildlife. The tone was neutral, professional, yet something in its urgency stood out. He answered what he could, reiterating his observations without embellishment. 2 days later, he received notice that the area would be temporarily closed pending assessment. The speed of the decision unsettled him. Mountain regions were rarely shut down quickly, especially in the off-season. Bureaucracy usually moved slower than erosion. Yet here, closures were enacted almost immediately, framed as a precautionary measure due to potential geological instability. Notices were posted online. Trail maps were updated. Access points were quietly restricted. He followed the updates closely, reading between lines. The language was vague but consistent, emphasizing safety without detailing cause. No mention was made of metal, of containers, of human-made structures. The mountain was described as unstable, unpredictable, in need of evaluation. He considered traveling back to observe the response firsthand, but hesitated. Something told him that presence would complicate rather than clarify. Instead, he watched remotely as the narrative settled into place. A week later, he was contacted again, this time with a request for an in-person debrief. The meeting took place in a modest administrative building, functional and unremarkable. He arrived early, noting the absence of signage that would suggest urgency or significance. Inside, he was greeted politely and escorted to a small room furnished with a table, chairs, and a single window overlooking a parking lot. The setting was deliberately ordinary. The questions that followed were precise. He was asked to recount his route in detail, to describe the chamber's dimensions, the nature of the stone, the appearance of the metallic object. The individuals across from him listened attentively, taking notes, occasionally requesting clarification. Their demeanor remained calm, almost disinterested, as though this were one case among many. Yet there were gaps. No one asked about the contents of the container. He noticed the omission immediately. He waited, expecting the topic to surface naturally, but it never did. The focus remained on access, stability, and risk. When he volunteered the information himself, describing the interior and the suitcases, the response was minimal. A brief nod, a note taken, no follow-up questions. The meeting concluded with assurances that the matter was being handled appropriately and that his cooperation was appreciated. He was advised not to return to the site for his own safety, a recommendation framed as concern rather than instruction. As he left the building, the sense of dissonance sharpened. The container, the money, the implications he had wrestled with alone in the mountains, all seemed to dissolve within the sterile confines of administrative language. The system he had engaged with was absorbing the anomaly not by understanding it, but by neutralizing it. In the days that followed, information began to thin. Online references to the closure remained, but details grew vaguer. The coordinates he had provided no longer aligned with public maps. The trail names he recognized were altered slightly, merged into broader categories. When he searched for discussions or reports related to unusual findings in the area, results were sparse and nonspecific. It was not that information had been contradicted. It had simply been diluted. He reached out again, requesting updates. The replies were courteous but noncommittal. Assessments were ongoing. No further action was required from him. The matter was considered resolved. Resolved was a word that did not fit. He became aware, slowly, of subtle changes in his own interactions. Messages he sent were acknowledged less promptly. Calls were redirected. When he attempted to access certain public records related to land use and geological surveys in the region, he encountered delays and restrictions that had not existed before. None of this was overt. Each instance could be explained in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern. The most unsettling moment came when he attempted to revisit the area virtually, using satellite imagery and mapping tools. The terrain appeared intact, but something was off. The resolution around the coordinates he had marked was lower, blurred slightly compared to surrounding regions. The effect was subtle enough to escape casual notice, yet once seen, it could not be unseen. The place was being erased, not physically, but representationally. He considered the possibility that this was coincidence, the result of routine data updates or seasonal adjustments, but the alignment with his report, with the rapid closure and the administrative silence, made coincidence increasingly implausible. The mountain itself remained unchanged. He was sure of that. Stone did not respond to paperwork. Yet the mountain's presence in the shared understanding of the world was being altered. It was being repositioned as unremarkable, as uninteresting, as something to be passed over. The realization carried an unexpected sense of loss. The place had never belonged to him, yet its removal from visibility felt personal. He had stood within it, breathed its air, touched its walls. Now it was being reduced to abstraction, stripped of context until it ceased to invite attention. With that loss came pressure. It arrived not as threat, but as suggestion. An email advising discretion for his own benefit. A conversation in which concern was expressed about the potential for misinterpretation or sensationalism. The message was consistent. Further discussion was unnecessary, potentially harmful, and unlikely to lead anywhere productive. No one told him to be silent. They did not need to. He recognized the technique from other contexts, from histories of suppression that did not rely on force but on fatigue. Make speech costly. Make attention unrewarding. Let interest dissipate on its own. The temptation to comply was strong. Silence would allow life to resume its familiar shape. The mountains would return to being a refuge rather than a reminder. He could choose to carry the knowledge privately, letting it fade into the background of memory. Yet something resisted that resolution. The container had not been built for a moment. It had been built to endure. Its creators had understood that systems outlast individuals, that influence persisted through preparation rather than visibility. To accept erasure without question felt like participation in a design he did not endorse. He began to document privately, not to publish, not to share widely, but to preserve. He wrote detailed accounts of his experience, mapping observations, recording impressions while they remained vivid. He stored copies in multiple places, analog and digital, unconnected, unindexed. This was not defiance, it was insurance. As weeks passed, the closure of the area became permanent. New justifications emerged, citing environmental protection, conservation, the need to limit human impact. The language shifted smoothly, absorbing the mountain into familiar narratives that discouraged curiosity. The place became less accessible, not only physically, but conceptually. Friends asked about his trip, about the weather, the views. He answered in generalities, offering nothing that invited further inquiry. He learned to compartmentalize, to hold the knowledge separate from daily interaction. Yet, the act of concealment changed him. It introduced a layer of caution into moments that had once felt open. He found himself looking differently at maps, at landscapes, at the spaces between marked routes and named places. He began to wonder how many such containers existed, not necessarily literal, but structural. How many reserves lay hidden beneath assumptions of emptiness. The mountain had not vanished, but the path to it had been folded inward, tucked away behind administrative language and blurred imagery. It existed now in a narrower sense, accessible only to those who already knew where to look. He understood then that the erasure was not an end, but a function. The system did not destroy anomalies. It integrated them, rendered them inert through classification and obscurity. The container was not hidden to be forgotten. It was hidden to remain available. And he, having seen it, now occupied an ambiguous position within that design. Not an enemy. Not an ally. A variable. The knowledge settled into him slowly, altering his relationship with the world around him. Places no longer felt neutral. Absence no longer meant emptiness. Silence no longer implied ignorance. The mountain had taught him many things over the years: endurance, scale, humility. This time, it had taught him how easily a place could disappear without moving at all. Life resumed, but it did so imperfectly, like a mechanism reassembled with microscopic misalignments that only revealed themselves over time. On the surface, nothing in his circumstances had changed. He returned to work, to routines shaped by calendars and obligations. Days unfolded in familiar patterns, marked by ordinary concerns that once would have absorbed his attention completely. Yet, beneath that continuity, something fundamental had shifted, altering how each moment registered. He began to notice how often the world relied on assumed emptiness. Vacant lots passed without thought, remote regions labeled as uninhabited, blank spaces on maps that invited no scrutiny. Before, these absences had felt neutral, even comforting, places where nothing demanded explanation. Now they felt provisional, like surfaces stretched thin over unknown structures. The mountains, once his refuge, no longer offered uncomplicated solace. When he thought of them, he did not picture ridgelines or snowfields, but interiors, volumes carved from stone, spaces engineered to endure. He understood now that wilderness and infrastructure were not opposites, but layers. The wild could conceal as effectively as any city, perhaps more so, because it discouraged inspection by virtue of scale and difficulty. He continued to hike, though differently. His routes remained remote, his pace deliberate, but his attention had shifted. He found himself studying formations not for beauty or challenge, but for irregularities. Straight lines where curves should dominate, shadows that did not behave as expected. He became attuned to the possibility of design hidden within apparent randomness. Nothing else revealed itself. No second container. No hidden chamber. The mountains did not open again. That absence did not reassure him. It confirmed his growing belief that such places were not accidental nor plentiful in the way myth suggested. They were rare by necessity, each one expensive in effort and secrecy. Their value lay not in number, but in distribution. He reflected often on the container's purpose, allowing his understanding to mature beyond initial shock. It was not merely a vault. It was a stabilizer, a counterweight against volatility. Money stored outside systems could move independently of collapse, bypassing frozen accounts, disrupted markets, or contested jurisdictions. It could be deployed where law faltered and urgency overrode legitimacy. The realization reframed many events he had once considered unrelated. Sudden funding appearing in failed states, movements that persisted despite sanctions, operations that required liquidity without trace. He began to see how such reserves might function as invisible joints in the skeleton of global power, allowing it to bend without breaking. He did not know who controlled the container he had found. That question gradually lost its urgency. Ownership mattered less than function. Whoever held access at any given moment was likely less important than the continuity of the system itself. Knowledge passed hand to hand, role to role, not as property but as responsibility. He wondered how many people like him existed, scattered across time, who had encountered fragments of this hidden architecture. Not enough to form a group, too isolated to compare notes. Each one burdened with partial awareness, forced to reconcile it alone. The thought did not comfort him. He noticed changes in himself that were harder to articulate. A reluctance to accept official explanations without friction, a tendency to pause before assuming causality. He became slower to judge, not out of indecision, but because he recognized how much of reality operated beyond visible layers. Friends remarked that he seemed more reserved, quieter. He listened more than he spoke, not because he had nothing to say, but because he weighed the cost of speech differently now. Words felt less disposable. Information felt heavier. At times, he considered what might have happened had he chosen differently. if he had taken a suitcase, if he had spoken publicly, if he had returned with others. Each scenario ended the same way in his mind. The system would have responded not dramatically, but efficiently. Consequences would have arrived not as punishment, but as correction. He had not been threatened. He had not been rewarded. That neutrality, he realized, was the most telling response of all. It meant he had not disrupted the system's function. He had merely brushed against it. The container remained where it was, sealed within stone, unchanged by his presence. Yet its impact on him continued to unfold. It had introduced asymmetry into his understanding of the world. He could no longer pretend that power always announced itself or that absence equaled void. Months passed, seasons shifted, snow melted from peaks, revealing rock that had not moved in centuries. Trails reopened and closed again. The mountain range returned to circulation, guiding hikers along permitted routes that skirted the sealed core he alone knew lay beneath. He stopped checking maps for changes. He stopped searching for confirmation. The need for external validation faded. The truth of the container did not depend on recognition. One evening, while reviewing notes he had written shortly after the discovery, he realized something that had eluded him before. The container's greatest function was not the money it held, but the discipline it represented. Someone had believed strongly enough in preparation to invest enormous effort into an asset that might never be used. That belief required patience, humility, and a long view rarely rewarded in visible ways. It was, in a strange sense, an expression of faith. Not faith in ideology or morality, but in continuity. In the assumption that the world would change repeatedly and that survival depended on readiness rather than control. This understanding altered how he viewed his own life. He had always sought stability through movement, through withdrawal into landscapes that stripped existence down to essentials. Now, he recognized that preparation did not require isolation. It required awareness. He began to think of his knowledge as a kind of reserve, not to be spent impulsively, not to be displayed, but to be held. It informed his choices quietly, influencing where he placed trust, how he evaluated risk, how he interpreted silence. The mountain had not made him cynical. It had made him precise. In time, the container ceased to occupy his daily thoughts. It settled into the deeper strata of memory, surfacing only when events echoed its logic. A sudden infusion of resources where none should exist. An unexplained continuity amid apparent collapse. Each time, he recognized the pattern without needing confirmation. The world had not become darker. It had become more dimensional. He continued to hike, though now he chose routes less for solitude and more for perspective. From high ridges, he looked down not just at valleys and roads, but at the idea of concealment itself. He understood that what endured longest often did so by remaining unseen. The narrow entrance in the rock still existed, though no map marked it and no sign pointed the way. Snow and shadow would continue to guard it, indifferent to human attention. The container within would wait, patient as stone, ready for a future contingency that might never come. And he, having passed through that threshold once, carried forward a quieter, heavier awareness that beneath the calm surfaces of the world lay structures shaped not by chance, but by intention. That some truths were not meant to be revealed, only encountered. His life did not end at the mouth of a hidden cave. It continued, altered not by wealth or danger, but by comprehension. He had gone into the mountains, seeking distance from systems he did not trust. He returned, knowing that systems extended everywhere, even into stone, and that sometimes the most powerful places were those that did not move, did not speak, and did not need to be found again to continue shaping the world. If this story made you question what might be hidden beneath the surface of the world, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. More stories like this are already waiting, and the next one may change how you see reality even more. Share this video with someone who loves mysteries, hidden truths, and stories that stay with you long after the ending.